You can begin by turning in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 13. The inspiration for this message came from two other messages that I've heard recently. One of them was at the feast this last year in St. Kitts by Mr. Arnold Hampton. And the second one here in the last month was a message by Mr. Phil Sandilands in the New Orleans congregation. And I guess, like most of you, I've heard these messages before. I've read scriptures, but there's certain times when you hear the same message, but it strikes you in a different way. You know, God's word doesn't change. The Bible is still the same today as it was when it was written. But how come sometimes we get the same thing, we read it, but it hits us a different way? These two sermons did this for me for this message or that Christ gave in the parable of the sower here in Matthew chapter 13. So we're going to look at this today, and I want to relate to you how this has changed for me and see if it might help you to see it in a new light as well. So let's go ahead and read the parable of the sower. We're going to start in verse 3 here of Matthew 13. He said, "Then he spoke many things to them in parables, saying, Behold, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell by the wayside. The birds came and devoured them. Some fell on stony places where they did not have much earth, and they immediately sprang up because they had no depth of earth. But when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away." Verse 7, "And some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprang up and choked them. But others fell on good ground and yielded a crop, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. So the explanation for this parable continues in verse 18. It says, "Therefore hear the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, then the wicked one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. This is he who receives seed by the wayside. But he who received the seed on stony places, this is he who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no root in himself, but endures only for a while. For when tribulation or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he stumbles." Verse 22, "Now he who receives seed among the thorns is he who hears the word, and the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and he becomes unfruitful." And finally, verse 23, "But he who receives seed on the good ground is he who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and produces some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. So what struck me about this from these two messages that I heard was that when I read this story, this parable, we get the whole story. We hear what happens from the time that they heard the word and then the result of that. But I started thinking about it, and these messages made me think about it, and that our story is not finished. My story is not finished. So where do I fall in this parable? Now, I think most of us would probably want to be in that fertile ground and probably think, yes, we hear the word, we've accepted it, we understand it, it's in our hearts. We're not in the stony ground. It's not, we've been through times when we've had persecution or tribulation, and we're still here, right? We hopefully are producing fruit. But what about the thorny ground? Could we be in the thorny ground? That's kind of what I want to talk about today is thorns. And are we worried about thorns springing up and choking what we know in the way of life that we know? So what are thorns like? Physical thorns. I'm sure we've all encountered with thorns. There's some that are big. I was clearing some property a couple months ago and came across those huge, like 2-inch thorns. And you want to steer clear of those, I promise you. But there's some thorns that we can expect. Like if you have a rose bush, you know that there's thorns on it. You know to be careful of the thorns that are on those kinds of plants. Some thorns are easy to see. But there's also little thorns. If you've ever walked across a grassy field, I know at least in Texas, and you look down after a little while, you probably have all these little burrs in your shoelaces and on your pants. And they're full of these little bitty thorns. You don't even realize they're there at first. But man, they are quite a pain to have to clean up, and they're all mangled in your shoelaces and stuff. So there's these little thorns, and they're sticky, and they latch onto you real easily. So I think in the same way, the cares of this world, as it explains in verse 22, that, let's read that again. Now he who received the seed among the thorns is he who hears the word, and the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and he becomes unfruitful. So for us in God's church, we can probably recognize the big thorns that he's talking about here. But what about little thorns? Are there little things that are part of the cares of this world that could be choking us? The big thorns are probably things we can identify, maybe the works of the flesh from Galatians 5. But what about little things that take our focus away? I think I got a couple of little thorns that I want to talk about here this afternoon. And one of those is the little thorn of distractions. I don't know anyone, and I won't ask for a show of hands, but is anyone less busy this year than they were last year? If so, I need to talk to you and figure out what your secret is. Because it doesn't seem like that happens. It seems like more and more of our time is being sucked away. Why is that? We're in control of our lives, right? We're in control of our schedules and our commitments. Why are we so busy? That's a distraction. It can become a distraction for us. We also live in a time when everything is at our fingertips, right? Anything we want to know, we can pull a distraction device out of our pocket and look it up, and there you go. We live in a time when people become impatient because they're so used to instant gratification. So is that a thorn? Is that something that can then cause us to have problems? Well, on its own, probably not. There's a balance there, of course, amongst all these things. But what if we start to combine more and more of these? More and more things start to vie for our time and distract us from what we really should be focused on in our Christian lives and our spiritual lives. Could that be part of Satan's plan? Could be. What about politics and current events? We're in the thick of it, aren't we? This year is going to be certainly interesting and is not going to get any better as far as all of the mudslinging and the different things that come across with an election year. We can become consumed with just trying to keep track of all that. Well, he said this and they said that. Is that something that can become a thorn to us and keep us from really focusing and putting the emphasis on where it should be in our spiritual walk? I think it certainly can. If we start to add these up, can we see how those thorns can start to grow? Maybe one individually doesn't seem like it's all that much of an issue, but maybe it's cutting into our prayer time, or we haven't fasted in a while. Something to think about. What about vanity? Could that be a thorn? Something else that seems like has become on almost an exponential scale is that our society is just so consumed with the self, the selfie, the self-promotion, fame, reality TV. Who cares what all these people's lives are doing? Why does that matter to us? The curiosity of other people's lives. Could that be a thorn that takes our time, keeps us from doing what we should be doing, pulls us in all these different directions? You start to add all these things up, and it could start to have an impact. So, when I started this message, preparing it, I wasn't thinking of it in the context of, well, we're We're on the bubble of the Passover season, right? But it does apply, right? But I think this kind of inspection and looking into our lives is something we need to be doing constantly, because there's constantly pressures that are coming to us. We need to, look at what we're doing and evaluate what we are, our Christian lives during the Passover season, but this is something we could be doing all the time. We have to recognize those thorns that come up, especially the little ones that we may not realize are on us. We don't want to, at the end of the age or the end of our lives, whichever comes first, to look back and have regret. We don't want to look back and say, well, I knew what I was supposed to do, but I didn't do it. I didn't make the time. I was a mediocre Christian. I don't think that's going to go over too well. You could look further into this with the story of the 10 virgins and 5 that didn't have their oil. We don't want to let Satan choke us out with these little thorns. We can't let him do that. And one of the signs that we need to be watching for, if we look in Luke 21, is exactly what we're talking about here, these thorns. If we look in Luke 21 and verse 34, Luke 21, verse 34, says, "But take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness." Those are probably some big thorns, right? We probably realize we're not supposed to be going out getting drunk and carousing and doing reveling and all that stuff. But then it says, "And the cares of this life, that the day come on you unexpectedly." So we have to be watchful for that, and I think it's especially hard these days when we have so many things that are pulling at us. We don't want to watch so much, though, that we get negligent in the important areas of our life. We have to make sure we're taking care of those things. I heard once a sports analogy of someone that they lost a game. They said, well, we didn't lose, we just ran out of time. If we would have had more time, we would have pulled this out, right? Well, we don't want to be there when, at the end of our life. We don't want to look back and say, well, I just ran out of time to get my life in order to get rid of those thorns. It's interesting to think about, well, maybe we are on fertile soil, but there could be some thorns in our life too. We don't want to let Satan get in our lives and choke us that way. It's almost like the frog in the kettle scenario, where he keeps turning the heat up just a little bit and a little bit and a little bit, and you don't realize that you're about to boil. So let's watch for thorns. The big thorns are easy, right? But the little thorns can get to us. They can be there and we don't even realize it. But it's one thing that Satan can use to try and get to us. So remember this parable of the sower and watch for those thorns in your own life.